In the dying light of the old Republic, when Jedi walked as legends and Sith lurked as whispers, there lived a being who believed he had solved the universe's greatest equation, death itself. Picture a mind so brilliant it could calculate the movement of stars 1,000 years before they happened. A consciousness so vast it processed futures like you process a single breath. Now imagine that mind, trapped, not in a prison of stone or steel, but in something far worse, trapped in the space between life and death, aware of everything, capable of nothing, screaming in silence as the galaxy turns without him. This is the story of Darth Tenebrous, the Sith Lord who saw 1,000,000 possible futures but never saw his own end coming. A Bith engineer who built starships that crossed the galaxy while secretly plotting to live forever. He was the master who trained the master of Palpatine himself, the one who discovered secrets that would echo through generations, causing the fall of the Jedi and the rise of the Empire. But here is what the galaxy never knew. In his final moments, crushed beneath the wreckage of his own ambition, he executed a plan decades in the making. He tried to cheat death by stealing his apprentice body. He tried to become the virus that lives forever, and for one terrible moment, he succeeded. What happened next would haunt the dark side itself. Tonight we journey into the hidden chronicles of the Sith, to uncover the tragic tale of the calculating genius who believed mathematics could conquer mortality. This is the complete story of Darth Tenebrous, the Dark Lord who saw everything except the truth. Now, here is something interesting. About 71% of you watching are not subscribed yet. If you are enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars lore, hit that subscribe button. It truly helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more stories like this. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing our global community come together, whether you are drifting off to sleep or just starting your day. So go ahead, dim those lights, get comfortable under your blanket, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. Let yourself sink into the story, and let us begin this journey into darkness, calculation, and the Sith Lord who tried to live forever. Our tale unfolds in the shadows of the final century before the Clone Wars, approximately 167 years before the Battle of Yavin. This was an era of deception, when the Sith grand plan hummed like a distant engine, building toward a crescendo the Jedi could not hear. The Republic stood tall, confident, blind to the rot spreading through its foundations, and in those foundations, hidden like a cancer, worked the Sith. The Outer Rim territory stretched vast and lawless, far from the gleaming spires of Coruscant. Here, in forgotten systems and uncharted worlds, the Sith built their secret strongholds. Ancient temples crumbled on airless moons. Hidden laboratories hummed on mining worlds where no questions were asked, and on the harsh industrial planet of Bal'demnic, where cortosis ore glittered in dark caverns, destiny would one day arrive wearing the face of betrayal. But before that end, there was a beginning. There was Clarkter Zevon, a world of domed cities and mathematical beauty, home to the Bith species. And there was born a being named Rouges Gnome. The Bith were unlike most species in the galaxy. Evolution had granted them something extraordinary, a binary brain structure, two hemispheres working in perfect parallel, processing information simultaneously, calculating probabilities while others could barely count. Their large, pale heads housed minds that saw the universe in pure mathematics. Numbers sang to them, patterns revealed themselves like prophecies. They were natural engineers, natural scientists, natural artists who understood that music and mathematics were the same language. Rouges Gnome was a prodigy even among the Bith. While other children learned basic calculations, he mapped hyperspace routes in his mind. While others studied ship design, he revolutionized it. By the time he reached adulthood, his name echoed through corporate boardrooms across the galaxy. Rugus Gnome, the starship designer, the engineer whose vessels flew faster, smoother, more efficiently than any competitor could match. His navigation systems became industry standard. His hyperdrive modifications saved companies billions in fuel costs. Senators flew in ships he designed. Corporations paid fortunes for his consultations. The galaxy knew him as a genius. Respected, wealthy, sought after by the most powerful beings in civilized space. They saw the reserved Bith in elegant robes, speaking softly about thrust ratios and hull integrity. They saw brilliance wrapped in civility. They never saw the darkness. Because Rugus Gnome was only half the truth. The public face hiding a secret that would have shattered the Republic's peace. In the shadows, when the corporate meetings ended and the design consultations concluded, Rugus Gnome became something else entirely. He descended into hidden chambers where no light from Clactor Zevan's sun could reach. He opened holocrons that screamed with ancient malice. He meditated in the dark side of the Force, feeling its cold power flow through his analytical mind. In those shadows he was not Rugus Gnome. He was Darth Tenebrous, Dark Lord of the Sith, and he was calculating how to live forever. Clactor Zevan was a world that had learned from tragedy. Millennia ago, the Bith had nearly destroyed themselves in a war so devastating that it poisoned their entire planet. Cities burned, oceans boiled, the atmosphere itself became toxic. In the aftermath, the survivors sealed themselves in massive domed cities, climate-controlled environments where life could continue. From that near extinction came a cultural transformation. The Bith rejected violence. They embraced science, art, mathematics, and music. They became pacifists, philosophers, seekers of pure knowledge. Into this world of crystalline domes and mathematical harmony, Rugus Gnome was born. The year was approximately 167 years before the Battle of Yavin. Though the Bith kept meticulous records using their own calendar systems, his parents were both accomplished in their fields. His father designed architectural acoustics for concert halls. His mother composed symphonies that translated mathematical equations into sound. They expected their son to follow in their artistic footsteps. But Rugus was different from the beginning. While other Bith children played musical instruments and learned to appreciate the mathematical beauty of harmony, young Rugus was calculating starship trajectories. At age 5, when his instructors taught basic geometry, he was already solving complex three-dimensional calculus in his head. His binary brain hemispheres worked in perfect synchronization, processing information at speeds that left even his gifted teachers struggling to keep pace. The Bith brain structure was already remarkable, but Rugus possessed something beyond even his species' natural gifts. Where other Bith could process 2 streams of thought simultaneously, Rugus could manage dozens. He saw patterns invisible to others. Numbers spoke to him in languages that went beyond mere calculation. He could look at a starship design and instantly know with absolute certainty whether it would succeed or fail, not through testing or simulation, but through pure intuitive understanding. His instructors called it genius. They celebrated it. They nurtured it. They never recognized it for what it truly was. Force sensitivity manifesting through the lens of a mathematical mind. By his teenage years, Rugus had already attracted attention from engineering firms across the galaxy. His early designs for improved hyperdrive motivators were revolutionary. He understood that hyperspace travel was not just about raw power, but about finding the most efficient path through dimensions that bent and twisted according to gravitational fields. His navigation algorithms reduced jump times by 30%. His fuel efficiency modifications saved shipping companies fortunes. At 20, he left Clactor 7 for the first time. The transition was jarring. His homeworld was ordered, peaceful, predictable. The wider galaxy was chaos. Organic chaos. Beings driven by emotion rather than logic. decisions made on instinct rather than calculation. It frustrated him deeply. He could predict the trajectory of a million-ton freighter through hyperspace, but he could not predict why a senator would vote against his own interests, or why a business partner would lie when honesty was more profitable. The galaxy, he realized, was inefficient, wasteful, irrational. And he was force-sensitive, though he did not yet understand what that meant. His predictive abilities were not merely mathematical genius, though that genius was real. When he knew a ship design would work, it was because he felt it through the Force. When he chose the right business partner from a dozen candidates, it was because the Force whispered probability into his binary brain. When he avoided danger, stepping aside moments before a cargo container fell, or choosing not to board a ship that would later malfunction, it was foresight. The Force spoke to him in the language he understood best: numbers, probabilities, calculations. For years, he believed it was simply his superior intellect, the natural result of his Bith heritage combined with personal brilliance. He built a reputation, he accumulated wealth. He designed vessels that became legends: the Gnome Cruiser, a luxury transport favored by wealthy senators; the Ruges Navigator, a freighter class that revolutionized cargo shipping. His name became synonymous with reliability and innovation. But something gnawed at him beneath the success, a hunger his achievements could not satisfy. He noticed patterns that troubled him. Sometimes his predictions were impossibly accurate, beyond what any calculation should allow. Sometimes he dreamed of events that later occurred exactly as he had seen them. Sometimes, when he was angry or frustrated, machines around him would malfunction in ways that defied their engineering. He began researching, quietly, carefully, using his vast network of contacts and his considerable wealth to acquire rare texts and ancient databases. He studied Force philosophy, though at first only from an academic perspective. The Jedi were known to everyone, of course, but they seemed to him like religious mystics rather than true students of the Force's nature. They spoke of feelings and intuition. They rejected attachment and emotion. They made decisions based on vague notions of destiny and the will of the Force. It all seemed terribly inefficient to Ruges Gnome. Then, during a consultation on Dromund Kai Station, a forgotten outpost in what was once Sith space, he found something that changed everything. A data crystal hidden in the station's abandoned archives. The station had been built on the ruins of an ancient Sith facility, and the crystal had been overlooked during the Republic's cleansing of Sith artifacts. It was small, unremarkable, labeled as navigational data. It was not navigational data. It was a fragment of a Sith holocron, a teaching device from the old Sith Empire, damaged and incomplete, but still functional. When Ruges accessed it, a voice spoke to him from across millennia, not the ranting of a madman, or the seductions of a demon, as Jedi propaganda suggested Sith artifacts would contain. No, this voice spoke in terms he understood. It spoke of the Force as something quantifiable, something that could be studied, measured, manipulated according to scientific principles. The dark side, the voice explained, was not evil. It was simply the Force viewed through the lens of individual will and power. The Jedi limited themselves with dogma and restrictions. They served the Force rather than commanding it. But a true Force user could impose order on chaos, could calculate outcomes, and manifest them through sheer determination and knowledge. Ruges Gnome stood alone in that archive for hours, listening, understanding, feeling, for the first time in his life, that someone else saw the universe the way he did. The crystal was incomplete. The teachings were fragmented, but they were enough to plant a seed, enough to make him hunger for more. He took the crystal. He studied it obsessively, extracting every fragment of data. He began experimenting with the techniques it described. Carefully, secretly, he felt the dark side respond to him, cold and precise, like a mathematical proof that solved itself. And one day, not long after, in the cargo bay of a ship he was inspecting, a figure approached him, a being shrouded in dark robes, whose presence Ruges had somehow not noticed until that moment. The stranger spoke a single sentence. "You have been touched by knowledge, but you understand nothing yet. I can teach you to see the equation behind existence itself." Ruges Gnome, the brilliant engineer of Clactor's Evans, looked at this stranger and recognized something profound. This was no random encounter. This was the answer to the question his fragmented holocron could not complete. This was opportunity. This was power. This was the path his predictive abilities had been guiding him toward all along. He did not hesitate. He did not question. He did not feel fear. He felt only the cold satisfaction of a problem finding its solution. "Show me," Ruges Gnome said. And with those two words his fate was sealed. The starship designer would continue his public work, but his true education was about to begin. The education that would transform Ruges Gnome into Darth Tenebrous and set in motion events that would reshape the galaxy itself. But none of that was visible yet. To the galaxy, he remained simply Ruges Gnome, the eccentric Bith genius, and that was exactly how it needed to be. The rule of two demanded secrecy above all else, and secrecy, as Ruges Gnome understood with mathematical precision, was simply another form of efficiency. The being who would become his master never revealed a name. This was tradition among the Sith, a necessity born from Darth Bane's rule of two, always two. There were a master to embody power, an apprentice to crave it, but names were dangerous things. Names could be traced. Names could be discovered by Jedi, and so the Sith who recruited Ruges Gnome remained simply master throughout their time together. What Ruges learned later was that this being had been watching him for years. Every acquisition of Sith knowledge, every experiment with the dark side, every use of his predictive abilities left ripples in the Force. The Jedi, focused on their temples and their political entanglements, had not noticed these ripples. But the Sith were patient hunters. They noticed everything. The training began immediately, though not in the way stories suggest. There were no dramatic trials or tests of loyalty. There was no violence or torture designed to break his spirit. The Master understood that Ruges Gnome required a different approach. You do not break a calculating mind. You feed it. You give it problems to solve, and watch as it hungers for more complex equations. They traveled to the unknown regions, to worlds whose names had been erased from Republic star charts. Ancient Sith strongholds built by empires that fell millennia ago, on a moon orbiting a red giant. They walked through temples where the walls themselves seemed to breathe with dark side energy. The architecture defied conventional physics. Passages led in directions that should not exist. Chambers were larger inside than their exterior dimensions allowed. "The Force is not bound by the laws, you know," his master explained. "It creates laws. It breaks them. It is the foundation beneath reality itself. The Jedi teach surrender to its will. They are fools. The Force respects strength. Command it and it obeys." Ruges absorbed this philosophy like equations. It made perfect sense to his analytical mind. The Jedi were passive recipients of power. They did not truly understand. They spoke of serving the Force, of listening to its guidance. But why serve when you could command? Why listen when you could speak? His master taught him the history of the Sith, not the propaganda version the Jedi told, of evil sorcerers who fell to corruption and destroyed themselves. The true history. The Sith had been powerful beyond measure. They had built empires spanning thousands of systems. They had reshaped worlds with their will. They had achieved immortality through various means, though all those means had eventually failed or proven limited. Then came Darth Bane, who saw that the Sith were destroying themselves through internal conflict. Too many Dark Lords fighting for dominance. Too much infighting. too many betrayals that weakened the Order as a whole. So Bane created the rule of two, one master to hold power, one apprentice to crave it. When the apprentice grew strong enough, they would destroy the master and take an apprentice of their own, each generation stronger than the last, each generation adding to the accumulated knowledge and power. And alongside this rule came the grand plan, the systematic destruction of the Jedi Order and the Republic they served, not through open warfare, which the Sith had lost before, but through infiltration, manipulation, corruption from within. It would take centuries, but the Sith were patient. They worked in shadows, while the Jedi stood in the light blind to the darkness growing beneath them. Rugus understood the elegance of this immediately. It was efficient, logical, perfect. His master taught him to channel the Force through emotion, particularly anger and hatred. But Rugus found this difficult. Bith were not an emotional species. Their culture had bred passion out of them over thousands of years. He felt anger, certainly, but it was cold anger, intellectual frustration rather than burning rage. Then use that, his master said. The dark side cares nothing for how you access it. Rage works for some. For you, let it be cold calculation. Let it be the fury of a perfect mind confronting an imperfect galaxy. That is enough. And it was. When Rugus reached into the Force with his binary brain, when he imposed his will upon reality with mathematical precision, the dark side responded with devastating power. He learned to manipulate the minds of others, planting suggestions that felt like their own conclusions. He learned to unleash Force lightning, channeling raw energy through calculations of conductivity and resistance. He learned to enhance his physical abilities beyond what his Bith body should allow, redistributing cellular energy according to need. But his true gift, the ability his master prized above all others, was foresight. Most Force users who could see the future saw visions, fragmentary glimpses of what might be, symbolic imagery that required interpretation. Unclear warnings about possible dangers. It was an imprecise art, prone to misinterpretation and self-fulfilling prophecy. Regis's gnome saw probabilities. When he meditated on future events, his binary brain processed millions of possible timelines simultaneously. He saw branching paths, calculated the likelihood of each outcome, identified the variables that would determine which path manifested. It was not perfect. The future was too complex for perfect prediction, filled with too many independent actors making too many free choices. But it was far more reliable than visions. He could predict, with reasonable accuracy, which senators would vote which way on upcoming legislation, which business deals would succeed or fail, which individuals would become useful or dangerous, where the Jedi would focus their attention, where opportunities would arise for Sith manipulation. This ability made him invaluable to the grand plan. His master had him analyze galactic politics, financial systems, trade routes, military buildups. Rugus would calculate probability matrices, predicting how current events would cascade into future outcomes. Where should the Sith apply pressure? Which corporations should they infiltrate? Which conflicts should they encourage? The master provided the vision and the power. The apprentice provided the calculations and the predictions. Years passed. Rugus maintained his public identity as a starship designer, which provided perfect cover. He traveled constantly for legitimate business reasons, which allowed secret missions to go unnoticed. He met with influential beings across the galaxy, which enabled subtle manipulation of galactic affairs. And always, he learned. His master taught him techniques from ancient Sith, methods of prolonging life, ways to manipulate midi-chlorians, those microscopic organisms that allowed beings to touch the Force, secrets of Sith alchemy, though Rugus found these too imprecise for his tastes. Then came the day his master performed the ceremony that marked his full acceptance into the Sith Order. In a chamber deep beneath an unnamed world, Surrounded by artifacts from the old Sith Empire, his master spoke the words of power. "You are no longer merely my student. You have proven your worth through knowledge and strength. You understand the dark side not as chaos, but as order imposed by will. You see futures where others see only shadows. You are Sith. You are Darth Tenebrous." The name came from an ancient language, one of dozens spoken by the original Sith species. Tenebrous meant darkness, but not the darkness of ignorance. The darkness of the void between stars where everything was clear and calculable. The darkness that came before light, primal and fundamental. Ruges Nolme accepted the name with the same cold satisfaction he felt when solving a complex equation. He was Darth Tenebrous now, a dark lord of the Sith, one half of the rule of two. But there was a problem with the rule of two that his master perhaps had not fully considered. The apprentice was supposed to eventually surpass the master. That was the entire point. Each generation stronger than the last, which meant that one day Ruges would need to kill the being who taught him everything. His master knew this, of course, expected it, even welcomed it, in the strange way of the Sith. But knowing something intellectually and facing it practically are different things. Tenebrous began calculating when would be the optimal time. He was powerful now, but was he powerful enough? His foresight gave him an advantage, but his master had decades more experience. The probabilities shifted constantly. Too soon, and he would fail and die. Too late, and he might miss his opportunity or grow complacent. The answer came not through calculation, but through opportunity. His master grew careless. Age was catching up, slowing reflexes that had once been lightning quick, and during a mission to investigate ancient Sith ruins on a forgotten world, his master triggered a trap that Tenebrous had foreseen but not warned about. The killing was quick, efficient. His master, weakened and injured by the trap, looked up at him with something that might have been pride. "Well calculated, my apprentice. The Sith grow stronger with your ascension." Then came the lightning. The cold, calculated application of Force energy until life faded and Darth Tenebrous stood alone in the ruins. He felt no remorse, no guilt, no sadness, only the satisfaction of a problem solved. He was no longer apprentice, he was master now. And as master, he would need an apprentice of his own. But that could wait. He had work to do first, plans to refine, and most importantly, an obsession to pursue. His master had taught him techniques for prolonging life, methods used by ancient Sith lords to extend their existence for centuries, but these were imperfect, temporary. They postponed death, but could not prevent it. Darth Tenebrous looked at his master's cooling corpse and made a decision that would define the rest of his existence. He would not merely prolong life, he would conquer death entirely, not through mystical techniques or religious faith in the Force, but through science, through understanding midi-chlorians at a level no one had achieved before, through calculation and experimentation and cold mathematical certainty. He would achieve true immortality, and nothing, not even death itself, would stop him. The galaxy had no idea what was about to unfold. Darth Tenebrous now stood alone at the apex of Sith power, and he used that position with the same methodical precision he applied to starship engineering. His life became a carefully balanced equation. By day, Ruges Nome attended corporate meetings, refined hyperdrive designs, and consulted with senators on infrastructure projects. By night, Darth Tenebrous meditated in secret facilities, manipulated galactic events from shadows, and pushed the boundaries of what the Force could accomplish. The duality would have driven most beings to madness. The constant deception, the need to maintain two completely separate personas, the weight of secrets that could never be shared. But Tenebrous found it efficient. Each identity supported the other. His legitimate business provided resources, information, and cover for his true work. His Sith knowledge enhanced his engineering, allowing him to create designs that seemed impossibly innovative, but were actually guided by Force, enhanced intuition. His binary Bith brain processed both lives simultaneously without conflict or confusion. Hemisphere 1 focused on the immediate conversation, the technical problem, the social manipulation required in the moment. Hemisphere 2 calculated larger patterns, monitored force currents, planned moves that would pay off years or decades later. He was never fully present in any single moment because part of him was always analyzing multiple time frames at once. This made him extraordinarily difficult to deceive or surprise. When a business partner lied, one hemisphere noticed the inconsistency in their story, while the other was already calculating how to use that lie to his advantage. When a senator tried to manipulate him politically, he saw not just their immediate goal but the three-step plan behind it, and had already formulated a counter-strategy that would turn their manipulation against them. His Force abilities had evolved beyond what his master had taught him. The foresight was the most dramatic, of course. He could meditate on a specific question and watch probability trees branch out before his mind's eye. If I invest in this company, what are the likely outcomes? If I reveal this secret to that senator, how will it cascade through political networks? If I subtly sabotage this treaty negotiation, what wars might begin, and what opportunities would those wars create? The answers were never certain. Free will existed. Chaos existed. Random chance could not be eliminated, but he could narrow the probabilities down to a manageable range. He could see which actions had a 70% chance of desired outcome versus which only had 30%, and over time, over hundreds of small decisions all calculated for optimal probability, he shaped galactic events like a sculptor shapes clay. But foresight was not his only gift. He had mastered traditional Sith powers to a level that would have impressed the ancient Dark Lords. His Force lightning was not wild electricity, but controlled energy, calculated for precise voltage and amperage. He could determine exactly how much power to use, enough to incapacitate, but not kill, enough to destroy a machine's circuits without damaging surrounding equipment, enough to torture with maximum pain but minimum tissue damage. His telekinesis worked on similar principles. Most Force users lifted objects through emotional effort, through pushing or pulling with their will. Tenebrous calculated mass, vectors, acceleration, and gravitational effects. He could manipulate a dozen objects simultaneously, each moving on different trajectories, because his binary brain tracked each one independently. During one mission, he had assassinated a corrupt Republic official by manipulating air currents in a sealed room, suffocating the target without leaving any physical evidence of foul play. The death was ruled natural causes. His mind manipulation abilities were perhaps most insidious. Telepathy, in the hands of most Force users, was crude. They imposed their will directly, forcing compliance through mental domination. Tenebrous understood that crude approaches left traces created resistance could be detected by Jedi. His method was far more subtle. He would plant suggestions that felt like the target's own thoughts. He understood how beings rationalized decisions, how they convinced themselves their choices were logical, so he would introduce premises that led inevitably to conclusions he desired. The target would walk away thinking they had decided something independently, never knowing their decision tree had been manipulated from the beginning. It was the mental equivalent of his probability calculations. He did not force specific outcomes, merely adjusted the likelihood of certain choices. This made him extraordinarily useful to the Sith Grand Plan. The plan, conceived by Darth Bane and refined by generations of Sith Lords, required patient manipulation of Republic institutions. The goal was not to destroy the Republic through external force, but to corrupt it from within, to make it betray its own principles, to turn its strengths into weaknesses. to ensure that when the Sith finally revealed themselves, the Republic would be too weak and compromised to resist. Tenebrous contributed to this plan in dozens of ways. His legitimate business in starship design gave him access to shipyards, military officials, and transportation networks. He introduced innovations that made the Republic dependent on his technology. Hyperdrive systems with built-in vulnerabilities he could later exploit. Navigation computers that transmitted data to secret Sith repositories. Freighter designs that were perfect for smuggling, should smuggling operations need to be encouraged for destabilization purposes. Through carefully placed investments, he gained influence over major corporations. He was a silent partner in the Outer Rim shipping conglomerate that would later merge with the Trade Federation. He owned shares in weapons manufacturers that supplied both Republic and independent systems. He advised banking institutions on interest rate policies, subtly pushing rates in directions that would strain Republic finances while enriching entities the Sith controlled. His political manipulation was even more subtle. He never directly bribed senators or blackmailed officials, nothing so crude. Instead, he would engineer situations where certain politicians naturally gained power while others naturally fell. A senator who supported centralized Republic authority would find their career mysteriously aided, favorable press coverage, lucky breaks, scandals affecting their opponents. Meanwhile, senators who advocated for system independence and local control also found unexpected support. The result was increasing polarization, both sides growing stronger, neither able to compromise, the Republic splitting into factions that hated each other more than any external enemy. This was the genius of the grand plan, not creating a single massive problem the Jedi could identify and address, but creating thousands of small problems, each one seemingly natural, each one subtly weakening the Republic's cohesion, like a hull developing microscopic stress fractures, each one too small to worry about, but together they would eventually cause catastrophic failure. Tenebrous also built physical infrastructure for future Sith operations. Using his wealth and business connections, he acquired properties across the galaxy. Abandoned mining facilities in the Outer Rim, converted into secret laboratories, warehouse districts in industrial systems, hiding weapons caches and equipment, underground bunkers on remote worlds, stocked with supplies and information. He was preparing for a war he would likely not live to see, but that his successors would need to fight. His secret facilities became centers of dangerous experimentation. He hired researchers, never telling them who truly employed them, setting them to work on projects they believed were legitimate. Weapon development, medical research, genetic engineering. The researchers thought they worked for shell corporations pursuing profit. They had no idea their discoveries were being funneled to a Sith Lord studying the secrets of life and death. His laboratories contained collections of ancient Sith artifacts, carefully acquired over decades. Holocrons containing knowledge from long-dead Dark Lords, alchemical devices whose purposes he was still deciphering, meditation chambers aligned to dark side energy flows, and in the most secure facilities, his personal experiments, cloning vats, gene sequences, equipment for studying midi-chlorians at the cellular level. Because underneath all the political manipulation and the infrastructure building and the service to the grand plan, Tenebrous had a personal obsession that grew stronger with each passing year. He was approximately 90 standard years old now. For a Bith, that was middle-aged. His species could live to 200 or beyond, especially with force-enhanced vitality. But 200 was not forever. Even if he stretched his life to 300 through Sith techniques, that was still a deadline. A hard stop to consciousness, an end to calculation. Unacceptable. Death was the ultimate equation he could not solve. The one variable he could not control, and it gnawed at him constantly. His foresight showed him possible futures extending centuries ahead. He could see the fall of the Jedi, the rise of a Sith Empire, changes and wonders he would never witness if he died in a mere 2 centuries. His master had taught him techniques used by ancient Sith lords to prolong life. Darth Tenebrous had achieved a form of immortality through essence transfer, though it required consuming other beings' life forces. Darth Tenebrous had transformed himself into something like a force vampire, though he lost his physical body and humanity in the process. Darth Vitiate had performed a ritual of such dark power that he lived for over 1,000 years, though the ritual required sacrificing millions of lives. These techniques worked, after a fashion, but they were imperfect. They had costs. They changed you into something that was no longer really you. Tenebrous wanted something better. True immortality, consciousness preserved perfectly, not twisted into some hunger-driven entity. Rational thought maintained indefinitely. The ability to continue calculating, predicting, planning, forever. And he believed he had found the answer. Not in mystical rituals or force alchemy, but in science, in understanding midi-chlorians at a level no one else had achieved. Midi-chlorians were microscopic organisms that lived symbiotically in the cells of all living beings. Those with high midi-chlorian counts could touch the Force more easily. The prevailing theory was that midi-chlorians were simply conduits, translating between living beings and the energy field of the Force. But Tenebrous suspected something more radical. What if consciousness itself existed in midi-chlorians? What if your thoughts, memories, personality were not products of your brain but of the midi-chlorians distributed throughout your body, with the brain merely serving as a processing center? If that were true, then consciousness could potentially be transferred by moving midi-chlorians. If he could take his midi-chlorians, infused with his consciousness and personality, and introduce them into another body, he could effectively be reborn in that body. The host's original consciousness would be overwhelmed, outnumbered by the invading midi-chlorians carrying his thoughts. He called this theory the maxi-chlorian hypothesis. Enhanced midi-chlorians, restructured to carry consciousness more efficiently. If he could perfect this technique, he could achieve perfect immortality. His body could die, but his consciousness would transfer into a new vessel. He could repeat this process indefinitely, living forever in a series of bodies. The only challenge was finding the right vessel. The host would need to be force-sensitive, with high midi-chlorian counts. They would need to be physically strong and healthy, and most importantly, they would need to be someone Tenebrous had access to, someone whose death would not raise suspicion. The answer was obvious. His future apprentice, according to the rule of 2, he needed to train an apprentice anyway, and when his body finally failed, he would simply take his apprentice's body as his new vessel. The apprentice would be honored. In a way, their consciousness erased. Yes, but their body continuing the great work of the Sith. It was perfectly efficient, elegantly logical. All he needed was the right candidate, someone powerful enough to be worth the effort, someone malleable enough to be controlled, someone whose body was suitable for long-term habitation. Darth Tenebrous smiled his cold, calculated smile. Somewhere in the galaxy, that perfect apprentice was waiting to be found. And when he found them, everything would fall into place. The equation would finally balance, death would be solved, and Darth Tenebrous would prove that immortality was not a mystical dream but a mathematical certainty. He just needed to find the right variables. The obsession consumed him in ways no other pursuit ever had. Tenebrous had mastered starship design, accumulated vast wealth, achieved Sith lordship, and contributed significantly to the grand plan. But all of it felt hollow when measured against the approaching certainty of his own extinction. What good was shaping the galaxy's future if he would not be present to witness the results? What value had knowledge if it died with him? He established his most secret laboratory on an asteroid in the subterrane system, a forgotten corner of space where few ships ever ventured. The facility was disguised as a mining operation, with all the proper permits and registered ownership through layers of shell corporations. Workers came and went on scheduled rotations, extracting mineral ore that was genuinely valuable enough to justify the operation's existence. They never knew that beneath the mining tunnels, 20 levels down in chambers shielded from all scanners, their employer conducted experiments that would horrify them. The research began with simple observations. Tenebrous spent years studying his own midi-chlorians under advanced microscopes, using equipment he had designed himself. The microscopic organisms were fascinating at that level of detail. They had structure, organization, almost like tiny machines. They responded to his force use, becoming more active when he channeled energy, dimming when he rested. They communicated with each other through chemical signals he was only beginning to decode. Most beings with force sensitivity never thought about their midi-chlorians beyond knowing they had them. Even Jedi studied midi-chlorians only to measure potential, counting them to determine if younglings had sufficient connection to the Force for training. But Tenebrous looked deeper. He wanted to understand the mechanism. How did these organisms bridge the gap between physical matter and the cosmic force? How did they translate biological processes into mystical power? His initial experiments used animals, small creatures at first, then larger ones. He would extract midi-chlorians from one subject and attempt to introduce them into another. Most subjects died immediately, their immune systems rejecting the foreign organisms. Some survived but showed no change in force sensitivity. A handful displayed strange effects, enhanced strength for brief periods, unusual behavioral changes. One creature, a primate species native to Kashyyyk, developed rudimentary telepathic abilities for 3 days before dying of massive organ failure. The results were inconsistent but encouraging. The midi-chlorians could be transferred. They could influence the host body, but controlling the process required far more understanding than he currently possessed. He needed to decode the midi-chlorian communication system. He needed to understand how they stored information, and most critically, he needed to determine whether consciousness itself resided in these organisms or merely interfaced through them. That question obsessed him for decades. Was your mind a product of your brain's neural networks, with midi-chlorians simply allowing that mind to touch the Force, or were the midi-chlorians themselves the storage medium for consciousness, with the brain serving only as a processing interface? The distinction was crucial. If consciousness lived in the brain, then his transfer plan would fail. The target body's brain would maintain its original consciousness, and at best, he might achieve a merged personality. But if consciousness existed in the midi-chlorians themselves, distributed throughout the body at the cellular level, then transferring midi-chlorians meant transferring the self. He conducted experiments that would have resulted in his immediate execution if discovered. Testing on sentient subjects, prisoners acquired through intermediaries who asked no questions. He would introduce foreign midi-chlorians into their systems and observe the effects. Mental deterioration. Personality changes. In a few cases, subjects reported hearing voices, feeling alien thoughts intruding on their own. These experiments always ended in the subject's death, but they provided valuable data. The breakthrough came when he realized that midi-chlorians adapted to their host over time. A person's midi-chlorians were not generic. They were customized through years of inhabiting that specific body, interfacing with that specific brain, channeling that specific person's force usage. Your midi-chlorians learned you. They became imprinted with patterns of thought, habits of force manipulation, the unique signature of your consciousness. If he could preserve that imprinting, enhance it, and then introduce those imprinted midi-chlorians into a new host in sufficient numbers, they might overwhelm the host's native organisms. The host's own midi-chlorians would be outnumbered, their signals drowned out by the invading population. And if consciousness truly distributed across the midi-chlorian population, rather than centralizing in the brain, then the invading consciousness would dominate. He called them midi-chlorians, enhanced midi-chlorians, restructured at the genetic level to be more robust, more communicative, better at storing and transmitting the patterns that defined his consciousness. He spent years developing the process. Failed attempts outnumbered successes by hundreds to one. Subjects died in convulsions. Some went catatonic. Others developed multiple personalities as their original consciousness fought the invading one. But slowly, painfully, with the patience only a Sith planning in centuries could maintain, he refined the technique. He learned to restructure his own midi-chlorians without killing himself. He developed chemical triggers that would activate the transfer process at the moment of death. He calculated the precise ratio needed. His midi-chlorians would need to outnumber the host's native population by at least 5 to 1 for guaranteed dominance. Anything less risked the host consciousness surviving as a competing presence, which would be worse than death. The Subterrel facility became the center of this dark work, but it was not his only laboratory. He had similar installations on 4 other worlds, each pursuing different aspects of the research. One focused on longevity techniques to buy him more time. Another studied consciousness transfer in its purest form, attempting to move awareness between bodies without relying on midi-chlorian infection. A third explored Sith alchemy, seeking ancient techniques he might combine with modern science. The fourth, his most heavily secured facility, held his greatest secret, a cloning program. Cloning technology existed, though it was primitive and unreliable. Most clones suffered from genetic degradation, developing fatal flaws within years. But Tenebrous theorized that clones might serve as emergency vessels if his primary plan failed. A clone of himself would theoretically already have his midi-chlorian structure, making the transfer easier. Of course, clones also lacked force sensitivity. In most cases, something about the cloning process disrupted the midi-chlorian population. But he pursued the research anyway. Multiple approaches increased probability of success. His most ambitious and catastrophic experiment occurred on Subterrel itself. He had developed a retrovirus designed to alter midi-chlorians in living subjects. The theory was elegant. Release the virus into a population, let it spread naturally, and observe how modified midi-chlorians behaved in thousands of subjects simultaneously. The data would be invaluable. He released it in the mining colony, among the workers who unknowingly labored above his secret laboratory. The virus was supposed to be subtle, causing only minor midi-chlorian mutations that would be undetectable without sophisticated equipment. It was supposed to be harmless. It was not harmless. The virus mutated in ways his calculations had not predicted. Within weeks, workers began showing symptoms: neurological damage, organ failure, psychotic episodes. The midi-chlorian alterations were causing cascade failures in cellular processes throughout the body. People were dying, and they were dying in agony. Tenebrous observed this disaster with cold detachment. The experiment had failed, but failure provided data. He documented everything: the mutation rates, the progression of symptoms, the way some individuals' immune systems fought the retrovirus, while others succumbed immediately. He noted which genetic profiles showed resistance and which showed vulnerability. Then he sterilized the facility. Not to save the remaining workers, that would have required revealing his presence and knowledge, but to prevent the retrovirus from spreading beyond Subterrel, he manipulated atmosphere controls, flooding certain sections with toxic gas. He caused accidents that sealed contaminated areas. He ensured no infected person left the asteroid alive. The official death toll was 97 workers. Mining accident. According to the reports, structural collapse in the deep tunnels, tragic but not suspicious. No investigation was launched. The families received compensation from the shell corporation that nominally owned the facility, and Darth Tenebrous added the data to his research files. This was the price of immortality. Not the deaths themselves, he felt no guilt about that, but the setback. The realization that his control was imperfect, that biology could surprise even his calculations. It made him more cautious, but no less determined. He would achieve immortality. The question was no longer if, but when and how. His research continued for decades. He made incremental progress, small successes that brought him closer to the ultimate goal. He learned to consciously manipulate his own midi-chlorians, feeling them respond to his will like obedient servants. He could sense them in others, reading force potential with unprecedented accuracy, and most importantly, he perfected the transfer mechanism. The process would activate at the moment of death. As his body failed, his enhanced midi-chlorians would separate from dying tissue and flow outward through the force. If an appropriate host was nearby, someone with whom he had established a force bond, his consciousness-bearing organisms would invade that host. The target would feel it happening, but would be unable to resist. Within minutes, hours at most, the original consciousness would be suppressed, and Darth Tenebrous would awaken in a new body. All he needed was that appropriate host, someone force-sensitive, someone physically strong and healthy, someone young enough to last another century or more, someone he had trained, creating the necessary force bond that would serve as a pathway for the transfer. He needed an apprentice. Not just any apprentice, but one specifically selected and prepared for this purpose. The apprentice would train for decades, never knowing they were being groomed as a vessel. They would develop their own force abilities, creating a powerful body perfect for Tenebrous to inhabit. They would even be grateful for the knowledge he shared, right up until the moment he stole their body and erased their existence. It was perfect, elegant, efficient. The rule of two demanded he'd take an apprentice anyway. This simply gave that requirement an additional purpose. The apprentice thought they trained to eventually surpass and replace their master, but instead, the master would replace the apprentice from within. Tenebrous meditated on this plan in his secret chambers, feeling satisfied in the way only a solved equation could satisfy him. Every variable accounted for, every probability calculated. Every possible failure point identified and counted. Somewhere in the galaxy, his perfect victim waited to be discovered, a being with force potential, ambition, and a body suitable for long-term habitation. Tenebrous would find this person. He would train them. He would bond with them, and when his biological body finally failed, he would be reborn in theirs. Death believed it would claim Darth Tenebrous eventually, but Tenebrous had calculated a way around that certainty. He would prove that mortality was simply another law of the universe waiting to be broken, and breaking the laws of the universe was what Sith Lords did best. The search for his apprentice began in earnest, and when he finally identified the perfect candidate, everything would fall into place exactly as he had foreseen. Almost exactly, anyway. There was always that small margin of error, that chaos factor he could never quite eliminate from his calculations, but the probability of success was high enough. 93% by his estimates. He would learn far too late that it was the remaining 7% that mattered most. The search took years, which frustrated Tenebrous but did not surprise him. Finding force-sensitive beings was not difficult. The galaxy teemed with them. Low-level sensitivity was relatively common, showing up in perhaps 1 in every few thousand beings. Individuals with sufficient force potential to actually wield it consciously were rarer, perhaps 1 in millions. And beings with true power, the kind that could reshape reality through will alone, were rare enough that the Jedi Order could identify and recruit most of them before anyone else noticed. But Tenebrous was not looking for just any force-sensitive. He needed specific qualities. High midi-chlorian count for power, obviously, but also a species with natural longevity and physical durability. There was no point stealing a body that would fail within decades. He needed a vessel that could last a century or more. The species also had to be intellectually capable. He would not tolerate inhabiting a body with limited cognitive function, and the candidate needed psychological traits that made them manipulable. Ambition was good, greed was useful. A certain coldness of personality was ideal. He established a network across the galaxy using his business connections and his accumulated wealth. Talent scouts, though they never knew they worked for a Sith Lord. They believed they identified gifted individuals for corporate recruitment or academic scholarships. They looked for young beings with unusual abilities, children who always won at games of chance, adolescents who seemed to know what others were thinking, young adults whose hunches about business or politics proved unnaturally accurate. Reports flowed to Tenebrous from dozens of worlds. He reviewed each one, calculating probability of force sensitivity, evaluating species compatibility, researching family backgrounds. Most candidates he dismissed immediately. Wrong species, too old, insufficient power, psychologically unsuitable. A few he investigated personally, traveling under his Rouges Gnome identity to observe from a distance. None proved adequate until he heard about a young moon on Mijito. The moon species immediately interested him. They were humanoid, but distinctly alien, with elongated heads, thin features, and natural mathematical aptitude that rivaled even the Bith. More importantly, moons were known for extraordinary longevity. They commonly lived to 200 standard years, and with proper care could reach 300 or beyond. A moon body enhanced by force longevity techniques could potentially last 5 centuries, perfect for his needs. Mijito itself was one of the galaxy's banking centers, a frozen world whose icy surface hid vast mineral wealth. The intergalactic banking clan maintained significant operations there, and Moan nobility dominated the financial sector. It was a world of cold efficiency, where profit margins mattered more than compassion and calculations determined social status. In other words, a cultural environment that produced the kind of personalities Tenebrous valued. The young Muon in question was named Higo Damask. He was 11 standard years old when Tenebrous first learned of him, already showing signs of extraordinary ability. His family was prominent within the banking clan. His father, Car Damask, held a senior position managing investments across multiple sectors. His mother came from another influential Muon family, with connections throughout the financial industry. Higo had been raised in privilege, educated by the finest tutors, groomed from birth to take his place among the banking elite. But Higo was different from other Moon children in ways his family found both promising and disturbing. His mathematical abilities exceeded even Moon standards. He could calculate compound interest over centuries in his head. He predicted market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy. He seemed to know which investments would succeed before any analysis justified that knowledge. His father attributed this to genius. His tutors called it intuition. Tenebrous recognized it immediately as force sensitivity, manifesting through a mind structured for calculation. The initial report came from one of Tenebrous's talent scouts, an investment analyst who occasionally consulted for the Damask family. The analyst mentioned, almost as an aside, that young Higo had an unsettling way of predicting outcomes, not through analysis, but through what seemed like pure knowing. The analyst found it unnerving but impressive. Tenebrous found it exactly what he had been searching for. He arranged a business meeting with Core Damask using his Rouges Gnome identity. The meeting's official purpose involved consultation on shipping investments and trade route optimization, services Tenebrous legitimately provided. But his actual goal was to observe young Higo, who his father brought along to learn the family business. The moment Tenebrous entered the room, he felt it, the Force presence, raw and undisciplined but unmistakably powerful. The boy had no idea what he possessed. To him, it was simply an enhanced version of the mathematical intuition all Moans experienced. He thought his predictive abilities were just extreme intelligence. He had no concept of midi-chlorians or the force or the power sleeping inside his cells. Tenebrous observed Higo throughout the meeting. The boy was polite but cold, showing little emotion even for a Mon. He listened to the business discussion with evident interest, asking occasional questions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of financial systems. When Tenebrous mentioned certain investment opportunities, he noticed Higo's subtle reactions, a slight narrowing of the eyes at one suggestion, an almost imperceptible nod at another. The boy was unconsciously reading probabilities through the Force, sensing which paths would lead to profit and which to loss. After the formal meeting, Tenebrous requested a private conversation with Core Damask, claiming he had a business opportunity too sensitive for open discussion. Once alone, he planted a suggestion in the elder Damask's mind. It would be beneficial for young Hego to spend time with successful beings from various industries, learning different aspects of galactic commerce. Perhaps Rouges Gnome could serve as a mentor on occasion, teaching the boy about engineering and design alongside finance. An education in diverse fields would serve him well in the complex world of high-level banking. Core Damask agreed readily, not realizing the suggestion felt like his own idea. He was ambitious for his son, and saw value in connections with someone as influential as Rouges Gnome. Arrangements were made. Higo would visit Tenebrous's facilities periodically, learning about starship design and manufacturing processes. Perfectly innocent, perfectly logical, perfectly calculated. The first private session occurred 3 weeks later, at one of Tenebrous's legitimate engineering workshops on Munalinst, the Moon homeworld. Higo arrived precisely on time, his posture perfect, his manner professional despite his youth. Tenebrous showed him the facility, explaining hyperdrive mechanics and navigation system design. The boy absorbed it all with typical Moon efficiency, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and that unconscious force-guided intuition. Then Tenebrous led him to a private office and locked the door. Higo showed no alarm, merely curiosity. Tenebrous dropped the pretense. "You know things before they happen," he said simply. "Market movements, which people will be reliable and which will betray, which decisions will succeed and which will fail. You believe this is superior intelligence. It is not." Higo's expression did not change, but Tenebrous felt the spike of interest through the Force. Then what is it? Power. The same power wielded by Jedi, though they use it for foolish purposes. They call it the Force. They treat it as a mystical gift requiring humility and service. They are wrong. It is a tool, and like any tool, it can be mastered through understanding and will. He extended his hand and lifted a heavy equipment casing without touching it, suspending it in midair through pure telekinesis. Higo's eyes widened. The first real emotion Tenebrous had seen from him, not fear, hunger. "I can teach you to do this," Tenebrous said. "I can teach you to enhance the abilities you already possess. I can show you how to read minds, influence decisions, predict futures with accuracy beyond calculation. I can make you powerful in ways your banking clan colleagues could never imagine." Higo stared at the floating casing, then at Tenebrous. "Why would you do this? What do you want from me?" "Smart boy, suspicious. Good. I want a student, someone worthy of my knowledge. Your species lives long lives. Your mind is structured for the kind of disciplined thinking this power requires, and you have potential that would be wasted counting credits in a banking tower. My father would never allow this. Your father will not know. To him, to everyone, you will remain Higo Damask, banking heir and dutiful son. But in secret, you will learn what you are truly capable of. The choice is yours. Return to your comfortable, predictable life, or accept that you were meant for something greater." Tenebrous watched the boy process this. saw the hunger war with caution, saw ambition battle with fear. It took Higo exactly 23 seconds to make his decision. The fact that he decided at all, rather than refusing out of loyalty or fear, told Tenebrous everything he needed to know about the boy's character. "Teach me," Higo said. And Darth Tenebrous smiled his cold smile. Perfect. The vessel was found. Young, powerful, malleable, and completely unaware that he had just agreed to his eventual death. Over the coming decades, Tenebrous would train this boy to be strong, to be skilled, to develop a body enhanced by force power and Muin longevity. Higo Damask would think he was becoming a Sith Lord, but he was actually becoming a body for Darth Tenebrous to inhabit. The apprentice was simultaneously the successor and the sacrifice. The student who thought he was being empowered, but was actually being prepared for possession. Everything was falling into place. The equation was balancing, and neither Higo Damask nor his unsuspecting family had any idea what fate awaited him on a harsh industrial world called Bal'demnic, still decades away, but approaching with mathematical certainty. The training would begin immediately, and Darth Tenebrous would ensure his new apprentice became everything he needed him to be: strong enough to survive the transfer, skilled enough to be useful, but ultimately just a vessel waiting to be filled with another's consciousness. The perfect victim had been found. The training spanned nearly 5 decades, from the time Higo was 11 until the day everything ended on Bal'demnic. Those decades transformed a gifted but naive Mormon child into one of the most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history. What Tenebrous did not anticipate was that the student would exceed the teacher's calculations in ways that would ultimately prove fatal. The early years were foundational, built on secrecy and patience. Higo maintained his public identity flawlessly. He attended his lessons with private tutors. He learned banking protocols and investment strategies. He accompanied his father to business meetings and demonstrated appropriate interest in the family legacy. To everyone who knew him, he was exactly what he appeared to be: a brilliant young Muin being groomed for leadership in the financial sector. But several times each month, he would meet with Ruges Gnome for what his family believed were mentoring sessions in engineering and business. During these sessions, held in private facilities far from curious eyes, Higo learned his true education: the Force, the dark side. The power that would make him something far beyond a mere banker. Tenebrous taught him to meditate, to feel the Force flowing through and around him. For Higo, this came naturally in a way it did not for most students. His moon brain, already structured for mathematical thinking, perceived the Force as patterns, probability flows, energy currents that could be calculated and manipulated, where other Force sensitives described feeling the Force emotionally. Higo experienced it almost analytically. This pleased Tenebrous greatly. It meant his apprentice's mind worked similarly to his own. The basic abilities came quickly. Telekinesis was simple mathematics. Mass, distance, acceleration. Higo learned to lift objects by calculating the precise amount of force energy required. Within months, he could manipulate multiple items simultaneously, his mind tracking each one independently. Force-enhanced physical abilities were equally straightforward: redistribute cellular energy, enhance muscle response time, increase sensory acuity through controlled chemical releases in the brain. But the teaching went far beyond basic force manipulation. Tenebrous introduced Higo to Sith philosophy, explaining the rule of 2 and the grand plan. He described how generations of Sith had worked in shadows, slowly corrupting the Republic and positioning pieces for the Jedi Order's eventual destruction. He taught that power came not from brute force but from patience, planning, and manipulation of others. Higo absorbed this philosophy completely. It aligned perfectly with his moon cultural background. Banking was, after all, about long-term investment and gradual accumulation of power. The Sith Grand Plan was simply that same principle applied to galactic politics. Invest in chaos now, reap the rewards of dominion later. When Higo turned 16, Tenebrous decided he had earned advancement. In a ceremony performed in a hidden temple on a forgotten moon, with only master and apprentice present, Tenebrous bestowed the title. Higo Damask would continue to exist as a public identity, but in secret he would be known as Darth Plagueis. The name, like all Sith names, carried meaning. Plagueis, from an ancient word relating to disease, to things that spread unseen, to infections that corrupted from within. It suited him perfectly. He would be the plague that weakened the Republic from inside, that spread through financial systems and political networks, invisible until it was too late. As Plagueis matured into his 20s, the training intensified. Tenebrous took him on missions across the galaxy. They eliminated threats to the Grand Plan. A Jedi who had grown too curious about Outer Rim disappearances was killed in what appeared to be a pirate attack. A Republic investigator who stumbled on Sith financial networks died in a speeder accident. A corporate executive who refused to cooperate with their manipulations committed suicide after Plagueis invaded his mind and planted the suggestion. These missions taught Plagueis practical application of his abilities, how to kill without leaving evidence, how to manipulate minds without detection, how to arrange events that appeared natural but were actually calculated murders. Tenebrous observed his apprentice growing skill with satisfaction. The boy was cold, efficient, ruthless when required, perfect Sith material. But Tenebrous also noticed something that initially pleased him but would later cause concern. Plagueis had developed an obsession that mirrored his master's. He became fascinated by midi-chlorians and their relationship to life and death. During meditation exercises where Tenebrous taught force sensitivity to living things, Plagueis showed unprecedented ability to feel individual midi-chlorians, not just sensing them generally, but perceiving them individually, understanding their communication, feeling them respond to his will. Tenebrous had taught Plagueis about midi-chlorians intentionally. The apprentice needed that knowledge to be a suitable vessel for consciousness transfer. But Plagueis took the teaching far beyond what Tenebrous intended. He began conducting his own experiments, using his banking clan resources to acquire research equipment and subjects. He studied life at the cellular level. He attempted to influence midi-chlorians directly, increasing their concentration, altering their behavior, even trying to create new ones. This should have concerned Tenebrous immediately, but he rationalized it as useful research. If Plagueis strengthened his own midi-chlorian population, he would only become a better vessel. If he learned to manipulate life at the cellular level, he would be easier to control once Tenebrous possessed his body. The master told himself he was simply benefiting from his apprentice's initiative. The truth was that Plagueis was exceeding the parameters Tenebrous had calculated for him. The student was becoming too powerful too quickly, but Tenebrous convinced himself this was acceptable. After all, in a few more decades, that power would belong to him anyway. By the time Plagueis reached his 30s, he had grown into a formidable Sith Lord in his own right. His public identity was similarly powerful. Higo Damask had become Magister Damask, taking over significant banking clan operations after his father's untimely death. That death was officially ruled accidental, but Tenebrous suspected Plagueis had arranged it. The apprentice eliminating the father who represented his old life, clearing the way for his true path. Tenebrous approved. It showed proper Sith initiative. Magister Damask accumulated wealth and influence at an astonishing rate. He made investments that seemed risky but somehow always paid off. He cultivated relationships with politicians, military officials, and corporate leaders. He became known across the galaxy as a financial genius, someone whose favor was worth seeking and whose enmity was worth avoiding. All of this served the grand plan perfectly. The Sith needed economic power to manipulate galactic events, and Plagueis was building exactly that infrastructure. But in their private moments, when master and apprentice met in secret facilities to discuss Sith matters, Tenebrous felt the dynamic shifting. Plagueis asked questions that suggested independent thought about the grand plan's direction. He made suggestions about strategy that sometimes contradicted Tenebrous's calculations. He spoke with confidence that bordered on arrogance about his abilities and accomplishments. Most concerning, Plagueis sometimes challenged his master's teachings, not openly defiant. Never that, but he would present alternative interpretations of Sith philosophy. He would question whether the rule of two was optimal or merely traditional. He would propose modifications to the grand plan based on his own probability calculations, and sometimes, disturbingly often, his proposals were actually better than Tenebrous's original plans. This was the inherent flaw in the rule of two that perhaps Darth Bane had not fully considered. You needed to train your apprentice to be powerful enough to eventually replace you, but if they became powerful enough to replace you, they became dangerous before you were ready to be replaced. Tenebrous found himself in an uncomfortable position. His apprentice was fulfilling his role perfectly, growing stronger and more capable each year. But that growing strength meant the window for executing the consciousness transfer was narrowing. Tenebrous had originally planned to wait until his natural body began failing from age. He was perhaps 150 years old now, which for a force-enhanced Bith meant he had at least 50 years remaining. But Plagueis was 47, and his power was accelerating rather than plateauing. If Tenebrous waited too long, the apprentice might grow strong enough to resist the possession attempt. The host's will was the primary defense against consciousness transfer. A weak-willed host could be overwhelmed easily. But Plagueis's will was formidable, and growing more so each year. The Master began calculating a new timeline. Perhaps he should not wait for natural death. Perhaps he should arrange circumstances that would allow for the transfer sooner while he still had the advantage. The challenge was creating a situation that appeared accidental enough that Plagueis would not suspect betrayal. The moment the apprentice realized what his master had truly trained him for, he would become instantly hostile and defensive. The transfer required the apprentice to be unsuspecting and open, his force defenses down, his consciousness unprepared for invasion. Tenebrous meditated on this problem during the final years of their relationship. He needed a mission, something important enough to justify both their presences, something dangerous enough that his death would appear accidental, and something isolated enough that Plagueis would be the only suitable host nearby for his consciousness to flee into. The answer came when reports reached him about cortosis deposits on Bal'demnic. Cortosis was a valuable ore that could resist lightsabers, making it strategically important for the eventual war against the Jedi. The deposits were in a remote region, requiring travel to a harsh industrial world far from civilized space. Perfect. Tenebrous proposed the mission to Plagueis. They would travel to Bal'demnic together, assess the cortosis deposits, and establish mining operations that would provide resources for future Sith needs. It was exactly the kind of strategic preparation the grand plan required. Plagueis agreed without hesitation. He had no reason to suspect this was anything other than a legitimate mission. Tenebrous made his preparations carefully. He enhanced his midi-chlorian population, ensuring his consciousness would remain cohesive during transfer. He meditated extensively, visualizing the process, calculating probabilities. He set the plan in motion. His foresight showed him multiple possible futures branching from this mission. In most of them he succeeded. He died, transferred into Plagueis's body, and awoke reborn in a younger, more powerful vessel. In a few timelines, something went wrong. The transfer failed. He died permanently. But the probability of success was high, 87% by his calculations. What Tenebrous did not see, could not see, because his arrogance blinded him to certain possibilities, was that his apprentice had been preparing too. Plagueis had suspected for years that his master was hiding something. He had felt the suspicious edges of Tenebrous's plans through their force bond. He did not know exactly what his master intended, but he knew it was not what it appeared to be. And so when they departed, for Bal'demnic, master and apprentice both carried secrets. One believed he was executing a perfect plan. The other suspected a trap and was ready to spring one of his own. The stage was set. The equation Tenebrous had spent decades calculating was about to resolve, and he was about to learn that some variables refused to behave predictably, that chaos could never be fully eliminated, that life, consciousness, and the Force itself would never submit completely to mathematical certainty. Bal'demnic waited, and on that harsh world, Darth Tenebrous would discover that his greatest calculation contained a fatal error. The apprentice he had created to be his vessel would become his destroyer instead. While training Plagueis consumed much of his attention, Tenebrous never forgot his primary purpose. He was not merely a teacher grooming a successor. He was a Sith Lord serving a plan that stretched back 1,000 years to Darth Bane and forward into a future he might not live to see. Every action, every manipulation, every carefully placed piece on the galactic board served that singular vision, the complete destruction of the Jedi Order and the Republic they served. The brilliance of the grand plan lay in its patience. Previous Sith had failed because they acted too quickly, too openly. They declared war on the Jedi and lost because the Jedi were numerous, powerful, and had the backing of the entire Republic military. But Bane understood that true victory required making the Jedi destroy themselves, making the Republic rot from within until it begged for authoritarian control, creating conditions where the Sith revelation would come not as an invasion but as a salvation. Tenebrous's contribution to this plan operated on multiple fronts simultaneously. His binary brain allowed him to manage dozens of separate operations without losing track of how they interconnected. While one hemisphere monitored political manipulations, the other tracked economic sabotage. While he attended a corporate board meeting as Ruges Gnome, part of his mind was calculating the ramifications of a labor dispute he had secretly instigated 3 systems away. His most significant contribution was technological infiltration. As the galaxy's premier starship designer, Tenebrous had legitimate access to almost every major shipyard, manufacturing facility, and transportation network. The ships he designed were ubiquitous. Republic patrol vessels used his navigation systems, commercial freighters relied on his hyperdrive modifications. Even some Jedi consulars flew ships incorporating his innovations. What none of them knew was that every system he designed contained hidden features, backdoors in navigation computers that would transmit data to secret repositories, algorithms that could be remotely triggered to cause malfunctions, encryption protocols that appeared secure but had deliberate weaknesses the Sith could exploit. He was not sabotaging ships. Obviously, that would draw investigation, but he was ensuring that when the Sith eventually made their move, the galaxy's transportation infrastructure would become a weapon they could control. His work with the banking clan, facilitated through Plagueis' growing influence, opened another avenue of manipulation. The Galactic Republic ran on credit. Senators needed campaign funding. Corporations required investment capital. Planetary governments borrowed to finance infrastructure, and all of that money flowed through banks that the Sith were gradually infiltrating. Tenebrous did not need to control entire banks. That would be too obvious. Instead, he and Plagueis placed individuals in key positions, a loan officer here who could approve funding for sympathetic politicians, an investment manager there who could steer capital toward corporations the Sith wanted to empower, a risk assessor who could tank the credit rating of systems that needed to be weakened. Thousands of small decisions, each one appearing routine, collectively reshaping the economic landscape to Sith advantage. The political manipulations were even more subtle. Tenebrous never directly contacted senators or planetary leaders. That would leave traces. Instead, he created conditions that naturally led to the outcomes he desired. A senator who advocated for Jedi oversight found his career mysteriously flourishing. Favorable media coverage, campaign contributions from unknown sources, scandals affecting his opponents. That senator believed his success came from his political skills. He had no idea he was being guided. Conversely, senators who promoted Republic unity and Jedi authority found themselves plagued by problems, financial difficulties, personal scandals, investigations into minor improprieties that destroyed their credibility. They blamed bad luck or political enemies. They never suspected the systematic campaign orchestrated by an invisible enemy. The result was a gradual polarization of Republic politics. Senators increasingly split into factions: centralists who wanted stronger Republic authority versus regionalists who demanded planetary independence. Jedi supporters versus those who questioned Jedi involvement in political affairs, each side growing more extreme, less willing to compromise, more convinced the other side threatened everything they valued. This division served the grand plan perfectly. A united Republic would be difficult to overthrow, but a Republic tearing itself apart that could be pushed into civil war, and from the ashes of that war, the Sith would build their empire. Tenebrous also worked to undermine Jedi credibility through carefully orchestrated incidents. He would identify Force-sensitive children in remote systems before the Jedi discovered them. Then he would arrange for those children to cause accidents. A telepathic child who accidentally read disturbing thoughts and became traumatized. A telekinetic child who threw a tantrum and injured someone. When the Jedi finally arrived to recruit these children, local populations were already fearful and resentful. Why did the Jedi ignore these communities until Force powers caused problems? Why did they take children from their families without offering help sooner? These incidents were small individually, 1 or 2 per year across the vast galaxy. But over decades, they accumulated into a pattern. Public sentiment toward the Jedi slowly shifted from reverence to suspicion. Why did the Jedi hide in their temple on Coruscant instead of helping ordinary people? Why were they involved in Senate politics? Why did they claim to serve the Force but seem more interested in maintaining their own power? The Jedi noticed none of this. They were too focused on their traditional concerns, mediating trade disputes, investigating smuggling operations, training younglings in their temple. They believed themselves guardians of peace in a galaxy at peace. They did not see the thousands of small poisonings weakening the Republic's foundation. Some of Tenebrous's operations required direct violence, though he always ensured such violence appeared unconnected to any pattern. A Republic investigator who came too close to discovering Sith financial networks was killed by pirates. A journalist researching Force-sensitive disappearances died in a speeder crash. A Jedi Knight investigating strange activity in the Outer Rim vanished without a trace. Each incident isolated, each one explainable, no pattern visible unless you could see all the pieces simultaneously. And only Tenebrous could see all the pieces. His foresight allowed him to track consequences years into the future. He knew that the senator he manipulated today would vote for military expansion in a decade. He understood that the economic crisis he engineered now would lead to political instability later. He calculated how current tensions would cascade into future conflicts. This was his gift to the grand plan. Not just manipulating the present, but shaping probability curves for the future. Other Sith Lords could destroy enemies or corrupt politicians. Tenebrous could predict which enemies would become dangerous years before they acted, which politicians would eventually hold crucial positions, which events would trigger chain reactions of chaos. He shared some of this predictive work with Plagueis, teaching his apprentice to see beyond immediate circumstances. Together they calculated optimal intervention points. Where should they apply pressure to maximize future disruption? Which conflicts should they encourage, and which should they suppress? The master and apprentice working as a team, their combined analytical abilities producing strategies neither could achieve alone. One of their most successful operations involved the Trade Federation. This commercial organization had existed for centuries, managing shipping routes and cargo logistics. But Tenebrous and Plagueis gradually transformed it into something more dangerous. Through financial incentives and political maneuvering, they encouraged the Trade Federation to militarize, protection against pirates, officially. But the Federation was building a private army larger than many planetary defense forces. They also manipulated Trade Federation leadership, placing greedy and corruptible individuals in positions of authority. These leaders would be easy to control when the time came. Easy to convince that profit justified any action. Easy to turn into weapons against the Republic. The Jedi Council occasionally discussed concerns about growing corporate power and political polarization, but their discussions led nowhere. They saw problems, but not the pattern connecting them. They responded to symptoms while the disease spread unchecked, and Tenebrous watched their failures with cold satisfaction. The Jedi were doomed because they believed in reacting to threats rather than anticipating them. They trusted the Force to guide them rather than taking active control of destiny. In his secret facilities across the galaxy, Tenebrous maintained resources for future operations, weapons caches hidden on remote worlds, sleeper agents embedded in corporations and governments, financial assets that could be activated when needed, communication networks that bypassed official channels. He was building the infrastructure that would support the eventual Sith revelation. Some of this work he did alone, some he accomplished with Plagueis' assistance, and some he delegated to agents who had no idea they served the Sith. The beauty of the system was its compartmentalization. No single person except Tenebrous understood how all the pieces connected. Even Plagueis only saw the portions Tenebrous chose to reveal. As decades passed, the grand plan advanced steadily. The Republic grew weaker while appearing stable. The Jedi's reputation eroded while they remained confident. Corporate power increased while governmental authority declined. All the necessary conditions for collapse were being carefully constructed. And when that collapse finally came, when the Sith revealed themselves and seized control, it would seem almost inevitable, as if the Republic had been destined to fall all along. That was the deepest manipulation of all, making tyranny appear to be destiny, making the Sith takeover seem like the natural resolution of the Republic's contradictions rather than the result of 1,000 years of systematic sabotage. Tenebrous would not live to see the final victory. He knew that his calculations showed the culmination happening perhaps a century after his death, but he was building toward it anyway, laying foundations his successors would build upon. This was the Sith way, under the rule of two, each generation advancing the plan, each master and apprentice adding their piece to the grand design. And when the Empire finally rose, when Jedi were hunted to extinction and the Sith ruled openly at last, Darth Tenebrous's contributions would be woven into its foundation. His technological backdoors, his economic manipulations, his political polarizations, his predictions that had guided strategy for decades. He would be forgotten by history, as all Sith Lords under the rule of two were forgotten. But his work would endure. The galaxy would transform according to calculations he had performed a century earlier, and in a strange way, that was a kind of immortality. His consciousness might die, but his will would shape reality long after his body failed. Or so he thought, because Tenebrous was still planning for his other kind of immortality, the literal kind. The consciousness transfer that would let him continue his work in Plagueis' body. If that succeeded, he would see the grand plan's completion personally. He would witness the Jedi's destruction with his own eyes, even if those eyes belonged to someone else's face. But first, they had to travel to Bal'demnic. First, he had to execute the perfect plan he had calculated for years, and everything had to proceed exactly as his foresight predicted. The galaxy spun onward. The pieces moved into position, and Darth Tenebrous prepared for the moment that would determine whether his consciousness would continue forever or cease forever. He believed he had calculated every variable. He was wrong. Foresight had always been Tenebrous's greatest gift, but in his final years it became a burden that threatened to crush him beneath the weight of infinite possibility. Where once he had calculated futures with cold precision, now he drowned in visions that multiplied faster than he could process them. His binary brain, which had always granted him advantages over single-minded beings, now trapped him in a prison of perpetual prediction. Every decision spawned 1,000 possible futures. When he considered speaking to Plagueis about their upcoming mission to Bal'demnic, his mind automatically generated probability trees. If he mentioned it casually, 37% chance Plagueis would suspect nothing. If he framed it as urgent, 62% chance the apprentice would prioritize it. If he suggested they bring additional personnel, 91% chance Plagueis would question why. Each percentage led to further branches, further possibilities, cascading infinitely forward. He could not turn it off. The Force flowed through him constantly, feeding his analytical mind data about potential futures. He saw the Bal'demnic mission succeeding. He saw it failing catastrophically. He saw variations where Plagueis died instead, where they both survived unchanged, where the consciousness transfer worked perfectly, where it worked partially, creating a hybrid being that was neither Tenebrous nor Plagueis, where it killed them both. The visions came unbidden during meditation, during business meetings, during sleep. He would be reviewing a hyperdrive schematic and suddenly experience a flash of the Jedi Temple burning decades in the future. He would be calculating investment returns and see a vision of himself reborn in Plagueis's body, feeling young muscles respond to his ancient will. He would be eating a meal and glimpse his own death in 100 different variations. Most beings would have gone mad from such constant barrage of possible futures. Tenebrous's Bith brain prevented complete breakdown, but it could not prevent the psychological toll. He began experiencing what he clinically recognized as existential paralysis. When every choice leads to multiple futures, and you can perceive all those futures simultaneously, how do you choose? What makes one path more valid than another when you experience them all as equally real? The worst visions were the ones that showed him truths he did not want to accept. In one recurring vision, he saw himself lying crushed beneath mining equipment on Bal'demnic, his consciousness fragmenting as his body died, the transfer failing because Plagueis's will proved stronger than he had calculated. In another, he succeeded in possessing his apprentice's body, only to discover that Plagueis's consciousness survived as a competing presence, trapped together in eternal mental warfare. But the vision that disturbed him most showed something he had never considered. In this future, the consciousness transfer worked perfectly. He awoke in Plagueis's body, his mind intact, his memories preserved. And then, over the following years, he realized something horrifying. He was still going to die. The new body would age. The host's midi-chlorians would gradually reject the foreign consciousness. Within decades, he would face the same problem again. Immortality through body theft was not immortality at all. It was merely postponement, an extended suicide that required murdering others to temporarily stave off the inevitable. This vision shook him more than failure scenarios, because it suggested his entire plan was fundamentally flawed, that he had spent decades preparing for a solution that would not actually solve anything. He tried to dismiss the vision. Foresight showed possibilities, not certainties, that future might never manifest. But the mathematical probability calculations his brain performed automatically could not be silenced. 68% chance the transfer would fail completely. 23% chance it would create a temporary hybrid consciousness. 9% chance it would succeed as he intended. And of that 9%, 74% of paths showed the success being temporary. the possessed body rejecting his consciousness within years. By any reasonable analysis, his plan was likely to fail. The odds were terrible. Any rational being would abandon it and seek alternatives, but Tenebrous found himself unable to let go. He had invested too much, calculated too long, built his entire existence around this singular goal. To abandon it now would mean accepting that his life's work had been wasted, that he had pursued an impossible dream for decades. More than that, accepting failure meant accepting death. Real death, the permanent cessation of consciousness, the end of calculation. And Tenebrous could not accept that. His mind was too brilliant, too valuable to simply cease existing. The galaxy needed his intelligence, his foresight, his ability to shape futures. The grand plan required his contributions. Surely the universe could not be so wasteful as to extinguish such capability. This was the curse of genius. Lesser minds could accept mortality because they knew they would not be greatly missed. But Tenebrous understood exactly how valuable he was, how much would be lost when he died. His ego was not vanity, it was accurate self-assessment. He genuinely was extraordinary, and that made his eventual death not just tragic but cosmically unjust. The visions intensified. As the Bal'demnic mission approached, he saw himself standing before Plagueis, explaining the Cortosis deposit's importance. He saw them boarding the transport ship. He saw the harsh landscape of the industrial world, and then the vision split into chaos. Multiple simultaneous futures, each one diverging at critical decision points. In some futures, the mining equipment accident happened exactly as he had foreseen. In others, Plagueis noticed something wrong and prevented it. In some, the accident occurred, but both survived unharmed. In the most disturbing visions, Plagueis orchestrated the accident himself, having somehow predicted his master's true intentions. That last possibility kept Tenebrous awake during the meditation periods that passed for Bith's sleep. What if Plagueis suspected? The apprentice had grown powerful, perhaps powerful enough to have developed his own predictive abilities. What if Plagueis had calculated that his master intended betrayal? What if the entire mission to Bal'demnic was actually a trap, with each participant believing they were trapping the other? The paranoia fed on itself. Tenebrous found himself analyzing every interaction with Plagueis for signs of suspicion. A certain tone when discussing the mission, a pause before agreeing to the schedule, a question about why they both needed to be present. Were these innocent remarks or coded warnings that Plagueis knew? His analytical mind generated probability matrices of Plagueis' knowledge. 42% chance the apprentice suspected nothing. 37% chance he suspected something but did not know specifics. 15% chance he had discovered the consciousness transfer plan. 6% chance he had developed countermeasures. But here was the paradox that trapped Tenebrous completely. If he abandoned the Bal'demnic mission, he forfeited his only realistic chance at the transfer. His body was aging despite force enhancements. He had perhaps 20 years remaining at most. If he waited those 20 years for another opportunity, Plagueis would be even more powerful, even more difficult to possess. The window was closing. It was now or never. Yet if Plagueis suspected going to Bal'demnic was suicide, he would be delivering himself into a trap, dying on his apprentice's terms rather than his own. The rational choice was to cancel the mission and accept mortality, but Tenebrous could not force himself to make that rational choice. The hope of immortality, however slim, overruled logic. This was how the dark side consumed its servants, not through external temptation but through internal logic twisted by desire. Tenebrous understood intellectually that his plan was flawed, that his obsession had led him into a trap of his own making. But understanding the problem did not grant him the strength to choose differently. He was a machine that had calculated itself into a corner with no exit except the one he feared. In his final meditation before departing for Bal'demnic, Tenebrous experienced a vision clearer than any before. He saw himself dying, felt his body crushed, experienced his consciousness fragmenting as it tried to flee into Plagueis. And then, most disturbing of all, he felt awareness continuing after death, not successfully transferred, not reborn in a new body, but trapped in a liminal state between life and death, conscious but powerless, aware but unable to act. This vision terrified him more than extinction. Death might be terrible, but it was at least an ending. But this showed something worse, an immortality of helpless observation, consciousness preserved but agency destroyed, watching through Plagueis' senses but unable to control anything, unable to speak, unable to even die properly. Was this the Force warning him, or was it showing him the inevitable result of his hubris? Tenebrous did not know, could not know. His foresight showed him possibilities, but it could not tell him which possibility would manifest into reality. That was the fundamental limitation of prediction. You could calculate probabilities, but chaos always retained the final word. He thought about the ancient Sith Lords who had achieved various forms of immortality. Darth Undead, who bound his spirit to a holocron. Darth Nihilus, who became a wound in the Force. Darth Vitiate, who prolonged his life through consuming others. They had all paid prices for their extended existence. Undead was trapped in an artifact. Nihilus lost his humanity. Vitiate required constant sustenance through death. What price would Tenebrous pay? What would he sacrifice for continued consciousness? He told himself the price did not matter. Any cost was worth paying to avoid extinction. But in honest moments during deep meditation, he wondered if that was true. If the price of immortality was worse than death, was it still worth pursuing? These philosophical questions had no answers, only the approaching reality of Bal'demnic. The mission was scheduled. Plagueis was prepared. The cortosis deposits awaited assessment, and Darth Tenebrous would either achieve his immortality or meet his end. His last clear vision before departure showed him something unexpected. Not the mission itself, but far future consequences. He saw a figure in dark robes standing over the corpse of a Jedi, pulling back his hood to reveal a scarred, ancient face. He saw that figure manipulating a younger man, seducing him toward darkness. He saw the galaxy burning under an empire that bore the stamp of Sith philosophy made manifest. And in that vision, he understood. Whether he succeeded or failed on Bal'demnic, whether he achieved immortality or permanent death, his work would continue. The knowledge he taught Plagueis would pass to another apprentice. The techniques he developed would be refined and perfected. The grand plan would march forward regardless of whether Darth Tenebrous existed to witness it. Perhaps that should have comforted him. His legacy assured, his contributions guaranteed to matter. But it did not comfort him at all. Because legacy was not consciousness. Glory was not experience. He did not want to matter. He wanted to exist. The transport ship awaited. Bal'demnic called, and Darth Tenebrous, greatest mathematical genius in Sith history, walked toward his fate with equations running endlessly through his binary brain, calculating, predicting, foreseeing. Everything except the truth that mattered most. Bal'demnic was exactly as ugly as the reports suggested. A world of industrial scars and exploitation, where massive corporations had torn open the planet's crust in search of valuable ores. The cortosis deposits lay deep beneath a ravaged landscape of abandoned mining facilities, toxic waste ponds, and machinery graveyards. It was a world where nothing beautiful remained, where profit had consumed every other consideration. Perfect, in its way, remote, harsh. The kind of place where accidents happened and few questions were asked. Tenebrous and Plagueis arrived on a commercial transport, then transferred to a local shuttle operated by the mining consortium currently extracting cortosis. The pilot was a grizzled human who asked no questions, which was exactly the kind of discretion that made Bal'demnic useful for sensitive operations. The shuttle descended through atmosphere thick with industrial pollution, landing at a facility perched on the edge of a massive excavation. They spent 2 days touring the operations, inspecting cortosis quality, reviewing extraction efficiency. To the miners and corporate representatives, they were wealthy investors considering expansion of operations. Tenebrous played his Ruges Gnome role flawlessly, asking technical questions about ore processing and refining. Plagueis performed his Magister Damask persona equally well, calculating profit margins and return timelines. But beneath the performance, both Sith Lords were calculating different equations. Tenebrous was positioning pieces for his planned accident. Plagueis was watching his master with suspicion that had crystallized into near certainty. Something was wrong about this mission. He could feel it through the Force, that subliminal warning that danger approached. On the 3rd day, they descended into the deepest mining tunnels to examine a newly discovered cortosis vein. The mining consortium had arranged transport via a small cargo skiff, normally used for moving equipment in the cramped tunnels. The vessel was old, maintained barely adequately, operating in conditions that stressed every system, precisely the kind of vehicle that might malfunction. Tenebrous had arranged this through subtle manipulation of the consortium's scheduling systems weeks earlier, ensuring this specific skiff would be used, ensuring it would develop critical failures at the precise moment needed. His foresight had calculated the timing perfectly, or so he believed. They boarded the skiff with 2 miners serving as pilot and guide. The descent into the tunnels was harrowing, the small craft navigating passages carved by machinery, walls showing blast patterns and tool marks. The air grew hotter as they descended, the planet's geothermal energy making the deep tunnels uncomfortably warm, even for beings accustomed to climate control. Then, exactly as Tenebrous had foreseen, the problems began. The skiff's repulsor lift stuttered. The pilot cursed, manipulating controls that responded sluggishly. They were in a particularly deep section now, thousands of meters below the surface, in a natural cavern that mining had expanded into a vast underground chamber. The repulsor failed completely. The skiff dropped, not falling freely, but descending rapidly in a barely controlled plummet. The pilot fought the controls desperately. The guide was screaming. Tenebrous felt a strange calm, knowing this was the moment he had calculated for. His consciousness was ready, his midi-chlorians prepared to transfer. But then he noticed Plagueis was not panicking. His apprentice sat motionless, eyes closed, and Tenebrous felt through their Force bond what Plagueis was doing. The Moan was using the Force to sabotage the pilot's efforts, preventing the skiff from recovering, ensuring the crash would be fatal. In that instant, Tenebrous understood. Plagueis knew. He had always known, and he was not trying to save them. He was ensuring his master would die. The skiff impacted the cavern floor at tremendous velocity. The pilot and guide died instantly, their bodies crushed in the impact. Plagueis had wrapped himself in Force protection, surviving with injuries but alive, and Tenebrous found himself pinned beneath wreckage, his Bith body crushed from the chest down, internal organs ruptured, his binary brain struggling to process the catastrophic damage. He had seconds, perhaps minutes, before death. This was the moment. Execute the transfer now or die permanently. But as his consciousness began the separation from his dying flesh, as his midi-chlorians activated their program sequence, he felt Plagueis' awareness spike with recognition and fury. "I know what you are trying to do," Plagueis said, his voice somehow clear despite the ringing in Tenebrous' ears. The apprentice was injured but functional, dragging himself from the wreckage. "You trained me to be your vessel. You thought I would not understand." Tenebrous tried to speak, but his lungs were collapsed. Blood filled his throat. His vision was fading, but his consciousness remained sharp, his midi-chlorians carrying his awareness even as his body failed. He reached out through the Force, his maxi-chlorians flowing from dying tissue, seeking the host he had prepared for decades. Plagueis felt the invasion beginning, Tenebrous's consciousness entering his body like a virus, midi-chlorians carrying foreign awareness into his cells, and Plagueis reacted with the full force of his will and power. He had suspected this for years. He had prepared defenses. His own midi-chlorians, more numerous and more powerful than Tenebrous had calculated, formed barriers against the invasion. But Tenebrous had anticipated resistance. His maxi-chlorians were engineered specifically for this. They invaded Plagueis's cells aggressively, overwhelming local defenses, spreading through his body with terrible efficiency. For a moment, for one glorious, terrifying moment, Tenebrous thought he would succeed. He felt his consciousness taking root in Plagueis's flesh, felt neurons responding to his thoughts, felt the strength of a younger body becoming his to command. Then Plagueis struck back, not with force lightning or telekinesis, with something far more intimate, a battle fought at the cellular level, consciousness against consciousness, will against will. Plagueis' mind was a fortress, and Tenebrous found himself not conquering, but besieging. His maxi-chlorians spread throughout the host body, but they could not suppress the original consciousness. Plagueis' will was too strong, too focused, too absolutely determined to maintain his own existence. The result was a nightmare Tenebrous had not truly anticipated. His consciousness did not fail to transfer. It succeeded too well. He entered Plagueis's body completely, but he could not take control. He was trapped inside his apprentice, aware of everything, capable of nothing. A passenger in a vehicle he could not steer, a ghost haunting the body he had tried to steal. He could see through Plagueis's eyes, could hear through his ears, could feel every sensation of the physical body, but he could not move a single muscle, could not speak, could not even influence Plagueis's thoughts. He was utterly, completely helpless. And Plagueis knew he was there, could feel the foreign presence trapped in his midi-chlorians. The apprentice's first action was experimenting with this bizarre condition. He moved his hand, and Tenebrous experienced the movement but could not control it. He formed thoughts, and Tenebrous heard them but could not respond. It was the ultimate imprisonment, consciousness preserved but agency destroyed. Plagueis dragged himself from the wreckage, his injured body, protesting but functional. He looked down at what remained of Tenebrous's original body, crushed and broken, blood pooling beneath it. "You taught me everything about midi-chlorians," Plagueis said, speaking aloud though he knew Tenebrous could hear his thoughts. "Did you think I would not realize what you were preparing me for? Did you think I would not develop countermeasures?" Tenebrous screamed silently, his consciousness thrashing against the prison of Plagueis's mind. But there was no escape. His maxi-chlorians were spread throughout the host body, too diffused to reassemble into anything coherent. He existed as a distributed presence, fragments of consciousness scattered across billions of cells, still aware, still thinking, but utterly powerless. The horror of his situation crystallized. This was worse than death. Death was cessation, but this was eternal awareness without agency. He would experience everything Plagueis experienced, but as a prisoner forced to watch every sensation, every thought, every action, forever trapped inside the body he had tried to steal. Plagueis climbed from the wreckage, using the Force to enhance his damaged body's capabilities. He surveyed the crash site clinically. "You calculated everything except the most important variable," he said. "You never considered that I might be stronger than you predicted, that I might have will sufficient to resist you." The apprentice made his way toward the tunnel exit, leaving his master's corpse behind, and Tenebrous went with him, not by choice, but because his consciousness was now imprisoned in Plagueis' cells. He felt every step, every breath, every thought his former apprentice formed. He was experiencing existence from inside another being's mind, and the intimacy of it was violating beyond words. Days passed. Plagueis returned to civilization, reported the mining accident, attended to his master's funeral arrangements. And through all of it, Tenebrous remained trapped, experiencing his own memorial service from inside his killer's body. He heard Plagueis give a eulogy praising Rouges Gnome's contributions to galactic engineering, watched beings offer condolences to Magister Damask for losing a respected colleague. His death was a footnote in galactic affairs, a moderately famous engineer killed in an industrial accident, nothing more. But consciousness persisted. Months passed, and Tenebrous remained aware inside his apprentice. He watched Plagueis continue the work they had shared, watched him pursue his own research into immortality, building on everything Tenebrous had taught him, watched him become everything Tenebrous had wanted to be, but in his own body, under his own control. The torture was exquisite. Tenebrous had sought immortality, and achieved it in the worst possible way. He existed forever, but only as a prisoner. He could never act, never influence, never express his thoughts, only watch, only experience, only suffer the awareness of his own complete helplessness. Plagueis began experimenting with his condition, attempting to communicate with the trapped consciousness, trying to extract knowledge from Tenebrous's awareness, and Tenebrous felt these violations, felt his former apprentice rifling through his memories like files in a database, every secret exposed, every calculation stolen, everything he had ever been, now property of the student who had surpassed him. Then Plagueis began actively trying to purge the foreign consciousness. Using techniques derived from Tenebrous's own research, he attacked the midi-chlorians systematically, destroying them, fragmenting them, reducing the distributed consciousness that had been Darth Tenebrous into smaller and smaller pieces. And Tenebrous felt himself dying, not all at once, but gradually, awareness fading in sections as his midi-chlorians were destroyed, parts of his consciousness simply ceasing to exist, vanishing into nothing. It was death by degrees, consciousness eroding like stone under water. He felt the terror of extinction approaching slowly, unable to prevent it, unable even to beg for mercy. His last coherent thought, before awareness finally fragmented beyond recovery, was a realization that came too late. The force could not be calculated, consciousness could not be stolen, and the attempt to control destiny through pure intellect had always been doomed. The equation he had spent his life solving had no solution. Death always won. And then Darth Tenebrous ceased to exist. Not with the dramatic finality he had feared, but with a gradual dissolution, awareness fading, consciousness fragmenting into nothing. The brilliant mind that had calculated galaxies dying in pieces inside the body it had tried to steal, destroyed by the apprentice it had betrayed. The Sith who believed he could calculate death itself discovered only that death calculates better. The galaxy continued turning, indifferent to the fate of one Sith Lord who had tried to bend eternity to his will. Bal'demnic returned to its industrial rhythms. The mining operations extracted cortosis as they always had. The crash site was cleared, the bodies recovered, the incident documented and filed away. Within weeks few remembered the accident had even happened. Within months it was forgotten entirely. But Darth Tenebrous's influence did not fade with his consciousness. In death, he accomplished what he could not achieve in life. His knowledge, his techniques, his obsessions became the foundation for something far greater than his individual existence could ever have been. Darth Plagueis, freed from his master's presence after purging the trapped consciousness, took everything Tenebrous had taught him and refined it beyond recognition. The midi-chlorian research became Plagueis' own obsession with midi-chlorian manipulation. The consciousness transfer experiments informed Plagueis' attempts to conquer death through different means. Every technique Tenebrous had developed, every calculation he had performed, every secret he had discovered, became raw material for his apprentice's greater work. And when Plagueis eventually took his own apprentice, a human politician from Naboo named Palpatine, those teachings passed forward again. Palpatine learned midi-chlorian manipulation from Plagueis, who had learned it from Tenebrous, the techniques that would later be used in attempts to save Padme Amidala, that would contribute to the creation of Darth Vader, that would enable Palpatine to sustain his own aging body through decades of rule, all traced back to a Bith engineer's desperate quest for immortality. The technological infrastructure Tenebrous built served the Empire perfectly. The backdoors in navigation systems allowed Imperial forces to track rebel movements. The weaknesses deliberately engineered into Republic vessels made them vulnerable when the Clone Wars began. The financial networks he and Plagueis constructed enabled Palpatine to bankroll the war machine that conquered the galaxy. Every calculation, every hidden modification, every subtle sabotage paid dividends decades after Tenebrous' death. Even the Grand Plan's ultimate success owed debts to Tenebrous' contributions. The political polarization he encouraged created the instability that Palpatine exploited. The corporate militarization he facilitated gave the Separatists their droid armies. The Jedi's weakened reputation made their destruction more palatable to a fearful public. Tenebrous had laid groundwork that others built upon, creating the conditions for the Sith's final victory. In that sense, he achieved a form of immortality. Not the conscious, continued existence he craved, but something perhaps more lasting. His will shaped reality long after his awareness ceased. His calculations influenced events he never witnessed. The empire that rose from the Republic's ashes bore the stamp of his methodology, his patience, his systematic approach to reshaping civilization itself. But would that have satisfied him? Would knowing his work mattered compensate for losing his consciousness? Almost certainly not. Tenebrous wanted to experience, not merely to influence. He wanted to witness his victories, not simply enable them. Legacy without awareness was meaningless to a mind that valued thought above all else. And perhaps that was the fundamental flaw in his philosophy. He treated consciousness as the highest good, the thing worth any price to preserve. But consciousness without growth, trapped and helpless as he had been in Plagueis' body, revealed the limits of that valuation. Better to cease entirely than exist in helpless awareness. Better to end than to persist as a prisoner. The Force itself seemed to teach this lesson repeatedly. Every Sith who sought immortality paid terrible prices. Those who succeeded in prolonging existence discovered that extended life brought extended suffering. Tenebrous' failure was perhaps more merciful than success would have been. His consciousness dissolved rather than enduring forever in torment. His awareness ended rather than persisting in a prison of his own making. There is something peaceful in that, the acceptance that all things end, that consciousness, however brilliant, eventually returns to the cosmic force from which it emerged. Tenebrous fought this truth with every calculation, every experiment, every desperate plan. But in the end, the universe enforced its law. He was extraordinary, but not exempt. Brilliant, but not immortal. His mind could calculate stars, but it could not escape the fundamental condition of existence itself. The wound his failure left on the dark side eventually healed. The ripples of his dissolution faded, and what remained was simply the work he had done, divorced from the consciousness that had performed it. His starship designs continued serving the galaxy for decades. His mathematical theorems were taught in universities. His engineering innovations became standard practice. Rugus Gnome was remembered as a contributor to galactic progress, never knowing that identity had hidden something far darker. And Darth Tenebrous, he was forgotten entirely, as all Sith Lords under the rule of two were meant to be forgotten. No histories recorded his name. No monuments marked his existence. The Secret Order erased its members from galactic memory, ensuring that when the Sith finally revealed themselves, they would seem to appear from nowhere rather than showing the patient work of generations. Perhaps there is wisdom in that oblivion. The ego that demands to be remembered, that needs recognition and immortality, causes suffering. Tenebrous suffered because he could not accept cessation. But the galaxy did not need him to persist. It absorbed his contributions and moved forward without him, as it had absorbed countless others, and would continue doing so long after the Empire fell and the Sith were destroyed. On Bal'demnic, the cavern where Tenebrous died remained undisturbed for years. The mining consortium eventually sealed that section of tunnels, deeming it too unstable for continued operations. The cortosis there went unharvested. The crash site became a tomb, though no marker indicated what had occurred. Rock and metal and the deep silence of underground places were the only witnesses to a Sith Lord's final moments. Above ground, the planet's twin moons rose and set in their calculated orbits, mathematics perfect and indifferent. The stellar mechanics Tenebrous had once studied continued their eternal dance. Gravity wells curved space according to mass and distance. Stars burned hydrogen in fusion reactions that would continue billions of years beyond any consciousness that observed them. The universe followed its laws regardless of whether minds existed to calculate them. And in that indifference lies a kind of peace. The pressure to matter, to persist, to be remembered dissolves when confronted with cosmic scale. Tenebrous's consciousness occupied perhaps 70 years of a galaxy that had existed for billions. His awareness was a brief flicker against eternal darkness. Meaningful to him, certainly, but to the universe, simply another pattern forming and dissolving, no more significant than a wave on an ocean, no more permanent than a shadow at sunset. The dark side itself, that manifestation of the Force through individual will and passion, continued flowing through the galaxy. It touched other beings who would use it for their own purposes. It enabled Palpatine's rise and Vader's transformation and all the countless smaller evils that accompanied the Empire's reign. But it did not remember Darth Tenebrous. The Force has no memory of individuals, only the eternal present, the constant flow of energy through all living things. Perhaps that is the final lesson, that consciousness, precious as it feels to those who possess it, is not actually precious to the cosmos. We are temporary patterns in an eternal flow. We arise, exist briefly, and dissolve back into the source. Fighting that truth causes suffering. Accepting it brings peace. Tenebrous never learned that acceptance. He fought dissolution until the last fragment of awareness faded. But in ending, he rejoined the cosmic force regardless. His consciousness dispersed into the infinite, becoming part of the eternal energy that flows through all things. No longer Tenebrous, no longer calculating or predicting or planning, simply existing as undifferentiated force, present everywhere and nowhere, aware of nothing and everything simultaneously. And in that dissolution, perhaps, he finally found what he had sought all along, not immortality of individual consciousness, but participation in something truly eternal. Not the preservation of his brilliant mind, but the return of that brilliance to the infinite intelligence of the Force itself. The galaxy turns, stars are born and die, civilizations rise and fall, and the Force flows through it all, eternal and indifferent, and somehow, despite that indifference, sustaining all life. Tenebrous is gone. But the energy that composed him persists, transformed, recycled, part of the endless cycle of existence. There is peace in that, rest in that, an ending that is also a continuation, a death that is also a transformation. The equation finally balanced, not through calculation but through surrender. The problem solved not by genius but by acceptance. And so we leave him there, dissolved into the Force, consciousness ended, but energy eternal. The Sith who believed death was just another equation learned that some truths cannot be calculated, only experienced, only accepted, only finally surrendered to. Sleep now, traveler. Let the story rest as all stories must. Let consciousness drift as Tenebrous has drifted, not into death, but into the peaceful dissolution of sleep. The calculations can wait. The questions can wait. For now there is only the gentle dark, the quiet stillness, the slow descent into rest. The stars continue their calculated dance above Bal'demnic. The Force continues its eternal flow, and somewhere in that infinite present, the energy that was once a brilliant, troubled mind has found its peace at last. If you have enjoyed this journey into Star Wars history, into the hidden chronicles of the Sith, consider subscribing to continue exploring the galaxy's forgotten tales. There are always more stories waiting, more mysteries to uncover, more legends sleeping in the dark, waiting for someone to remember them. But for now, rest. Let the story fade into dreams. Let the galaxy spin on without your awareness, as it spun on without Tenebrous's. There is no shame in letting go, no failure in accepting that all things, even consciousness itself, must sometimes simply stop. Good night, traveler. May your rest be peaceful. May your dreams be gentle, and may you find, in sleep's temporary dissolution of awareness, the peace that Darth Tenebrous sought, but could only find in ending. The dark is not to be feared. It is simply where we rest between moments of light, and in that darkness, finally, all calculations cease.